IVM.
Hi everybody, just wanted to ask everyone for a quick favor. We're running a brand survey right now and would really appreciate it if you could let us know what you think about the advertising on IVM. Go to ivmpodcast.com/survey and do let us know. As part of this, we'll be selecting 10 random participants and sending them some IVM swag, so do fill out those surveys.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. We have something different in store for you today. We're going to be talking about how ideas of history, religion, culture, and identity come together in radicalization and political violence, and how countries are attempting to negotiate this. These are questions that often come up in diverse countries like India, and France has recently made some moves towards this, passing a bill in the lower house of parliament that has raised some pretty challenging questions about which we'll be exploring in today's episode. Joining us today is French political scientist Olivier Roy, a professor at the European University Institute in Florence, Italy. Dr. Roy has extensively studied and written about radicalization terrorism, specifically on the question of quote-unquote Islamist terror. And over the next half an hour or so, Aditya and I will be exploring these themes related to secularism, religion, public spaces, and the dynamics involved in violent extremism. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Roy.
Thank you.
We'll start with a personal question, if you don't mind. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got into political science and more specifically interested in subjects related to political violence and terrorism?
I started my studies with philosophy. So I was a teacher of philosophy during the 70s. But at the same time, I used to go to Afghanistan as a backpacker, by hitchhiking from France to Kabul. And every year, I used to go there to spend 1 or 2 months in Afghanistan. So I got accustomed with the language, with the people, with the country. But I was not, an anthropologist or a political scientist at that time. The turn was when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1979. And so I decided to take a leave from my job and to study from an academic point of view the development of the war in Afghanistan, the war against the Soviets. So I get accustomed with the people that call themselves mujahideen at that time. And so I discovered political Islam in Afghanistan. And I studied the movement. I studied the books on political Islam. And so in the course of the 8 years of the war, I became, I would say, also an expert on political Islam.
Hitchhiking to Kabul in the 70s sounds like a pretty interesting life choice, Dr. Roy. Like, how exactly did that end up happening? Would you hitchhike all the way across Europe and through Iran to get to Kabul?
Yeah. So I went through Turkey and I went also through Iran. I didn't like, at that time, Iran, because for me, it was too westernized, while Afghanistan was supposed to be, a traditional country along some Orientalist cliches. But I learned Persian, and so I became also knowledgeable in Iran. And when the Islamic Revolution in Iran took place, starting in 78 and becoming victorious in 79, I was in Iran also, traveling to Afghanistan or from Afghanistan. So I spent also 1 month, 2 months, in Iran to study the impact of the revolution on the civil society.
Yeah, it's really fascinating, and just how much things have changed since then, with starting with that pivotal year of 1979, as you mentioned. But coming to contemporary times, Professor, you have argued that today's jihadists are driven by a certain nihilism, and you've said that this doesn't have actually much to do with religion. Could you tell us what this thesis of yours, and also what is then driving the nihilism?
First, it has to do with religion. My view is that it's not because they read the Quran that they became suicide bombers or jihadists. But when they decide to join, political violence, they do this as Islamists. They believe in God, they believe that they will go to paradise, and so and so and so. I call them nihilists because since, the mid-90s, most, if not all, the terrorists perpetrated suicide actions. And in Syria, with ISIS, the Islamic State in Syria, suicide attacks was a very common pattern from the fighters. They used to attack and to die. And they knew that they were dying. They knew that when they decided to enlist the organization, they will die. So for me, what is new in terms of political violence with this kind of movement is their fascination for death. And this is something which is not rational, because the best fighters die. It's very clear, for instance, with the terrorist attacks in France. For about, I would say, 15 years, 2000 to 2015, the terrorists were well trained. They had a good logistical networks. They were professional, efficient, and so. But they died, all of them, except one, died in action. So after 2015, it's the end of the professional fighters. And what we have is some sort of lone wolf who are not very efficient. They can kill, of course, but their impact on the society is minimal. So that's what was my approach. Why are these people fascinated by death? Why are they choosing death? And I found that, in fact, they are not really interested in setting up an Islamic state and an Islamic society. When they go to Syria, for instance, or to Afghanistan, it's not to help to build a real Islamic society. It's to fight and to die. They are not interested for the next days, after the supposed victory of the Islamic Revolution. And that's a big difference with Iran or with the Muslim brothers, in the Middle East, who want to build a supposed true Islamic society. So that's why I use the term nihilism.
Right. And do we see this sort of nihilism elsewhere also, outside of, say, very specific Muslim populations?
We have very few precedents. There is one which is quite interesting, is the anarchists of the end of the 19th century.
Right.
They used to perpetrate assassinations, murderings, personalities and so. And most of them didn't try to escape when they achieved their goal. So most of them went for trial. They wanted to explain their ideas in front of the court, but they knew that they will be sentenced to death. And most of them were sentenced to death. So this nihilism is rare in the history of political violence, but we do find some other examples.
Another thing that I was a little curious about, Professor, is the fact that very often the discourse after a terrorist attack happens is that there's these kind of debates that happen over integration or lack of integration, right? So do you think that this argument that these radicals have been victimized by racism or xenophobia makes any sense at all?
It's a very common idea, I would say it's a cliche, but it's not supported by statistics. When for example, I took the number of terrorists acting in France from 1995 to now, and there are some interesting patterns. Of course, the majority of them is made of second-generation Muslims, so young people who were born in France from migrant Muslim parents. It's around 65%. But they are not all disenfranchised. We don't have, an over-representation of disenfranchised youth among the radicals. They are typical of their generation. But the second point, which is very interesting, is that we have a very high number of converts. I would say roughly 25% of the terrorists and jihadists are converts. converts from classical French families, many of them with a Catholic background, and coming from the west of France, so which is not a place where you have these destitute neighborhoods, etc., etc. And the percentage of converts is rising, so which is also quite interesting. And more precisely, it's rising among women now. We have now more than 50% of converts among female radicalized people. So this shows that the motivation, the main motivation, is not racism or unemployment and things like that. If it were, economic situation, then we would have a higher number of radicals because the economic situation is not good and the unemployment rate among second generation is quite high. Another point, which is interesting, is that we have very few third generation. And now I would say it is the age of the third generation. People whose grandfather came to France as migrants. And we have almost no radicalization among them. It doesn't mean that they are less suffering of racism or of a lack of integration. It means for me that the roots of the radicalization are not so much in economic situation. The roots are more in what I call deculturation of Islam. The fact that they are no more rooted in the traditional national Islam of their parents, and that they are reinventing their own Islam on a makeshift basis using internet and peer, networks of young, with no real religious culture. While the third generation, they have some sort of a new religious culture, or more exactly, an acculturated relationship to religion and society. They are French. They are French. Their language is French. It's not Arabic or Turkish and so. And they are more accustomed to experience their religion in the French secular context. So I would say that if we look at things, in a span of time of 20 years, it's not the issue is not social conditions and economic situation. The issue is more the relations to culture and to religion. The proof is that now that we are no more with the second generation, the present terrorists are not, most of them are not born in France. They are newcomers or people living on the margins of the French Muslim population.
There's a lot to think about there, but let's just come back to it after a quick ad break.
Hey, it's been another great week on the IBM Podcast Network. On Pesa Vesa, Anupam talks to Siddharth Mehta, CEO and MD of FreeCharge. They discuss buy now, pay later, neobanks, and a whole lot more. On our new show, The Longest Constitution, hosted by Priya Mirza, we look at what it actually has to say about things we come across in our daily lives. In our first episode, we touch upon adultery laws and why they treat men and women differently. Say No to Drama with Chetna kicks off with an episode on dating apps. Along with Aisha and Kunal, we celebrated Cyrus's birthday with a bunch of listener questions, birthday traditions, and a whole lot more. On the note, journalist Kaveri Banzai discusses her new book, The Three Khans, and how they see their Muslim identity. Do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, if you're enjoying this show or any other show for that matter, please do tell a friend. That's really helpful for us. And finally, we'd like to thank the sponsors on the network this week, Cited, Cred, Bank of Baroda, Intuit India, and CoinSwitch Kuber. We really do appreciate the support.
Okay, yeah. So there's a lot of really fascinating points you touched on here, Dr. Hua. So one thing that really interesting term that I came across in your writings is this idea that what we're seeing now is not the radicalization of Islam so much as the Islamization of radicalism, which I find a very interesting concept, right? Because I think broadly the point you're making is that though the general tendency is to associate this kind of political violence with a particular form of Islam or with people being quote unquote too Muslim, what we're instead seeing is that these people are very much disconnected from Muslim cultures instead. And instead, they are relying on these online resources to kind of justify the violent actions they plan on using the language that is spread by militant Islamic outfits.
Exactly. One of the, I would say, it's not an explanation, but a comparison. If we look outside political violence, if we look at youth violence without a reference to a political vision, we can see, a lot of this kind of suicidal nihilism. Let's take an example, the massacres in schools. We have few in France, but we have a lot of that in the USA, for instance. And the way of acting is very close to the way of acting of the terrorists. They announce on Facebook, on internet, that they will do something. They film themselves, preparing the attack, doing the attack. They kill as many people as they can kill in schools or in a crowded place. And then they die. Either they kill themselves or they wait for the police to kill them. So the way of acting is very similar. And here I find some sort of death culture, fascination for death, which is not necessarily linked with political ideology. But when it is linked with religious ideology, then we have the Islamist terrorists, the Islamic terrorists. So what we see here is the way some young people fascinated by death decide, for different reasons, to frame their nihilism in a religious framework. And it's a framework of apocalypse, the end of the time. I'll die, but everybody will die.
Absolutely. Yeah. What I also find fascinating about your argument is that you point out that overt or public signs of religiosity are not necessarily connected to potential for political violence, and that brings me to France's law, this controversial secularism law. Can you tell us what it actually aims to do, how it fits into France's idea of secularism? And I guess we should also ask you, do you think it'll work?
Yes, France is a very particular case because secularism, I would say, is not just a way of life. It's a political culture, and even in a sense, it's a political ideology. The French secularism, what we call laïcité, started, to be set up after the French Revolution in 1789. And this ideology was set up against the Catholic Church. The big issue in France during all the 19th century is the conflict between the Republican state and the Catholic Church, identified with monarchy and with conservatism and with authoritarianism. So the French political secularism was built to protect the state from the church, which is totally different from secularism in the USA, for instance, where it was built to protect the churches from the state. And that's not the case in France. So we have a very political conception of laïcité. It is not just separation of church and state. It's a fight for the souls, if I can say that, for education and so and so. In 1905, a law was set up, was voted by the parliament, a law of separation, but it was also a law which allowed freedom of religion, and freedom of religious practices, and not just of religious thoughts, which means, for instance, in France, you can have religious schools. It's not forbidden at all. You can have religious processions in the streets, public prayers, and things like that. But the state should never be involved in that, and the state employees should be perfectly neutral and religiously blind, if I can say that. And during the 19th century, the last century, the Catholic Church adapted, to the law, to the situation. And I would say that since the 60s, the church has internalized the principles of secularism, laïcité. But with Islam, it's a bit different because Islam was seen as foreign at the beginning. And the idea, which is very, I would say, popular among the public opinion and the politicians, is that Islam has to adapt to France, and it has to adapt from a theological point of view. And that's the big debate, I would say the majority of the people in France, think that there should be some sort of religious enlightenment of Islam, and that there should be a more liberal theology. So the state is pushing very hard, the Muslim religious authorities to adopt a more enlightened Islam, which is a problem because the law forbids the intervention of the state in religious affairs. No, the state is not allowed to interfere in the religious institutions and religious creed, faith, theology, etc., etc. But it's what is happening now. The reason is that the dominant idea is that Islamic violence is a consequence of religious radicalization. In a word, the more you practice religion, the more you tend to be a radically violent, which is not confirmed by statistics. So, but the consequence, the idea is that religious violence is a consequence of the expansion of Salafism, of Islamic fundamentalism, and that we have to make a crackdown on religious fundamentalism to prevent radical violence. That's the spirit of the law, if I can say that. And once again, it's popular in France, and it's shared by most of our politicians from the right to the left, with the exception of the Greens, the ecologists, who usually are more open to religious issues than the other parties. Will it work? If the premise is wrong, then it will not work. If the young people who become violent don't do that because they have experienced religious fundamentalist indoctrination in mosques or in religious schools for years, and then they decide to jump into jihad and violence, it's not the case. The huge majority of the terrorists have no religious education. So to make a crackdown on religious education will not prevent the radicalization of the youth. That is my point of view. But I must say, I am in the minority now. So we can foresee that the government, with the approval of the public opinion, will go on by pushing pressure on Muslim institutions to adopt a more liberal view of religious practices and religious faith.
Professor, this is really interesting because the argument that you're making is quite nuanced and complex, right? And it kind of like flies in the face of this general stereotype, this general image that a lot of us seem to build based on the media we consume, that too much Islam is a bad thing, and Islam must be in a particular form in order to be acceptable in a heterodox or diverse society. Now, it seems that there's kind of this mix-up of two different issues that's happening right here. We have certainly religious fundamentalism can be an issue in a very diverse society, but it's more of a social problem. The problem that you're looking at in terms of political violence, young folks turning to this very nihilistic interpretation of a particular religion and kind of using that to justify violence and essentially quote unquote erase history in a way, are two very different things. And it seems like it's not just France, but more generally discourse related to Islam around the world, or more generally in secular societies, discourse related to religions, that seems to have a bit of a struggle dealing with this idea of that religious extremism or being religious does not directly lead to political violence.
Yeah, I think we should make a distinction. We have political violence, but the youth violence of today is not just political. There is a sort of culture of death which attracts a lot of disenfranchised youth. On the other hand, we have the development in all religions of fundamentalist forms of religion. We have the case in Catholicism, in Protestantism with the evangelicals, in Judaism, and in Hinduism also. But these new forms of fundamentalist religions may be a problem in terms, of civil society, of cohabitation between different religions, and so. But they are not necessarily linked with political violence. So the issue now is what to do with this surge of religious fundamentalism. And my view is that this surge of religious fundamentalism is a consequence of a general deculturation of religion. It's because the religions are more and more outside the dominant global culture of today, which is a very secular culture. It's a reaction in a sense. The second point is that what is the future of fundamentalism in religion? And I think I'm quite optimistic because I think that it's a matter of generations. The phenomena of born again started in the West, I would say from the 60s to the beginning of our century. But these fundamentalist people, they have children. And how can you be born from a born again? Because if you are born from a born again, you are no more a born again. You are in a new familial tradition. So we have a reculturation, I think, of fundamentalism. Or we have, I would say, a detachment, from the new generation of religious practices. Something which can be observed now in North Africa, for instance, among Muslims, or in America among the new generation of evangelicals.
I'd also like to ask you, it seems to me like there's a contradiction between the idea of promoting secular liberal values and at the same time trying to enforce it on others. How does France reconcile those two impulses?
What reconciles what?
So on the one hand, reconcile the idea of liberalism with the idea of trying to force it on people.
That's a big problem. The public opinion is not very liberal. The public opinion thinks that religion is too important to be given, I would say, to individuals. And it's a long historical tradition in France of political control on religion. We are a statist society. We are not a liberal society in the sense of Great Britain, for instance. But on the other hand, freedom of religion is in the Constitution. And so there are limits to the intervention of the state in religious affairs. And what we see now is how the courts are managing, the relationship. Because at the end, it's the courts. It's not the parliament. It's the courts which decide what is the room of religious freedom in France. So I am quite optimistic on this side that we are going towards a compromise between freedom of religion and the fear of religious separatism in our society.
That's very interesting. So, Doctor, who understand is you brought up this very interesting point earlier about how the global culture we participate in is very secular, right? And there's a general discomfort with religion in the public sphere in this interpretation of secularism. So, my question really is that given this discomfort, given that it often leads to religious groups being marginalized and being blamed for nihilistic acts committed by a few people using the terms of that religion to justify it, how really can a secular and diverse society deal with questions of religious identity and people just generally being religious while also perhaps tackling the nihilism that leads young people to indulge in political violence?
Religion is declining. There is no return of religion. There are less and less people who are practicing religious people. So what we have now is what I call the formatting of religion is an environment which is more and more secular. And these religions are not necessarily in tune with the dominant secular culture. So I think it's a process of formatting, of adaptation. The traditional connection between the dominant culture and religion is done. It's out. So what we see is a reconstruction of religion by the faithful, by the believers. And it's not a process which is easy, but it's on the way. I think we are going towards a new equilibrium, a new balance between the dominant secular culture and freedom of religion.
That's quite interesting, Dr. Roy. So do you think this is something that's happening across the world, or is it particularly in Europe that we're seeing this? Because I can think of a number of examples outside of Europe, Turkey, for example, or even in India, where certainly the relationship between the dominant culture and this idea of secularism is changing, but religious nationalism is also a thing. It's clearly very politically potent in a number of diverse and secular countries. So what kind of trends do you see in that space?
Europe is more and more secular, clearly, So the tensions are bigger in Europe than elsewhere. But I think the process of secularization is spreading, It doesn't mean that people stop to look for spirituality or for beliefs and so and so. But it's more an individual quest now and less a matter of setting up a religious community, a church, in a sense. So I think that this process of individualization of religion, which allows, a new kind of relationship between religion and secularism globally.
That's very interesting. That there's really quite a lot of food for thought there, especially this idea of the individualization of religion. I'm especially interested in exploring these questions in an Indian context, but we might not have time for that in this recording, of course. So, Aditya, do you have any further questions, or shall we wrap up?
I think Professor covered it.
All right, fantastic. Thank you so much, Professor. This has been a really interesting a really interesting discussion. We will have links to your writings in the description of this episode, and I highly recommend to all of our listeners that you go and check them out, because Professor Roy makes some very, very interesting arguments, and they've personally challenged me a lot to kind of rethink the way that I approach questions of secularism and religion in the public space. On that note, thank you all so much for listening to All Things Policy, and thank you so much, Professor, for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
The Takshashila Institution is an independent, non-partisan think tank and a school of public policy. We have education programs lasting 1 semester and 1 year that are tailored specifically for people like you. They are all online and you can take them from anywhere. Admissions are now open for our 12-week graduate certificate program in public policy, defense and foreign affairs, technology policy, and health and life sciences. Visit takshashila.org.in/courses to find out more.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
Have you ever wondered where the business world is headed? How the ways in which we create, market, and sell to consumers will evolve? Or if we'll ever go back to wearing pants while working? For answers to all of this and more, tune into Advertising is Dead with me, Varun Dugirala. Every Tuesday, as I talk to entrepreneurs, leaders, and change makers from across business, media, marketing, and beyond. You can catch all episodes of Advertising is Dead on the IVM Podcast website, app, or wherever you get your podcasts from.
Come learn and experience the ABCDs of being queer with me, Shunetro.
And me, Farhad.
On our show, Gay BCD.
The two of us take you through our stories and experiences of being gay men in the city of Mumbai and have candid
and sometimes downright scandalous
conversations about sexuality, gay culture, and everything in between.
Catch new episodes of Gay BCD every Tuesday on the IVM Podcast website, app, or wherever you get all your podcasts from.